Primetime Asia tonight. U.S. President Donald Trump begins his day by meeting Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong at the Istana. He says the historic summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un tomorrow could work out very nicely.
Sanctions will remain until North Korea completely and verifiably eliminates its weapons of mass destruction programs.
But Washington is willing to offer Pyongyang some security guarantees if it takes up complete denuclearization.
And kicking off tomorrow's summit, President Trump and Kim Jong-un will have a one-on-one meeting with only their translators present. Time for the two men to try and read one another. Hello, I'm Glenda Chong.
I'm John Leong, and welcome to our special extended coverage of the historic summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un that's only 14 hours away from kicking off.
And it's all happening right here in Singapore. And Channel News Asia is the only channel to stay tuned to because we have our reporters tracking all the latest news lines from locations across the island. April Hong will not only be bringing us the latest global market reactions, and she's also here to tell us where our reporters are.
That's right, Glenda and John. Our coverage will continue non-stop over the next 24 hours. Simon Marks, our U.S. Bureau Chief, is here with us in Singapore, and he's tracking President Donald Trump to find out what he hopes to accomplish and what could be on offer from the U.S. during the negotiations. Our Korea correspondent Lim Yan-suk will shed light on what's at stake for Seoul in light of the key role it's played in facilitating these talks. From the International Media Center, where over 2,500 journalists have gathered to cover this historic event, Don Tan will bring us the latest. But our coverage isn't just from here in the Lion City. Julie Yu is in Seoul. She's been talking to South Koreans and the business community there to find out what their expectations are. Over in China, Olivia Xiong is in Dandong City. It's on the border with North Korea and considered Pyongyang's gateway to the world. From Tokyo, Mitio Ishida reports on how Japan is hoping to bring focus onto the abductee issue, one that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has staked much political capital on.
Well, the countdown has started, and we're just hours away from the historic first meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a current North Korean leader. And ahead of that, some positivity. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says talks with Pyongyang are moving rapidly, but maintained that Washington's position on denuclearization has not changed.
Sanctions will remain until North Korea completely and verifiably eliminates its weapons of mass destruction programs. If diplomacy does not move in the right direction, and we are hopeful that it will continue to do so, those measures will increase. President Trump recognizes Chairman Kim's desire for security and is prepared to ensure that a North Korea free of weapons of mass destruction is also a secure North Korea.
His briefing to the U.S. press corps follows Mr. Trump's earlier saying that the summit with Mr. Kim Jong-un could work out very nicely. Mr. Trump visited Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong at the Istana, where both men held a private bilateral meeting before sitting down to a working lunch.
The North Korean leader himself visited Mr. Lee yesterday and thanked Singapore for hosting the summit. Mr. Kim will meet the U.S. president tomorrow at Sentosa's Capella Hotel.
North Korea's state-run media also heralded the summit as part of a changed era, one that could result in the two sides exchanging views to reset relations. KCNA says discussions will focus on the issue of building a permanent peacekeeping mechanism and the tricky issue of denuclearization, something Washington very much wants.
And for more on this, Lim Yan-suk is at the St. Regis Hotel where Kim Jong-un and his delegation are stationed. And we'll be speaking to her in a few minutes. But first, let's go over to Simon Marks. And he's at the Shangri-La Hotel where Donald Trump and the U.S. delegation are staying. So, Simon, how prepared are, U.S. President Donald Trump and his team for tomorrow's summit?
Well, Glenda, they insist, of course, that they are absolutely prepared. Donald Trump himself has said he's been preparing for this all his life. He's been in the Shangri-La Hotel for most of the day, apart from that trip to the Astana for his lunch and talks with the Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. And Mike Pompeo insists that the stage is now set for the United States to learn just how serious Kim Jong-un is about the potential denuclearization of North Korea. It's remarkable, isn't it? One dinner, one night of rest and one breakfast now separates Donald Trump from his history-making meeting with the North Korean leader. And I think from Mike Pompeo, we really got more of a sense of the kind of arrangement that the United States is now contemplating. Essentially, it's a carrot and stick approach. Mike Pompeo says that this summit is all about denuclearization, even if the North Koreans are seeking to push that down the agenda for the meeting. There are still talks underway about dotting the I's and crossing the T's for the meeting that will get underway at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And the essential compact that the United States is offering Kim Jong-un is this: you give up your nuclear weapons, you get to stay in power. That's quite a message to the North Korean leader, and quite a message to the North Korean people as well, should there be any in North Korea who were hoping that all of this may eventually one day lead to regime change in Pyongyang. That is very much not part of President Trump's approach to this summit. But there was also the threat of the stick. If North Korea does not agree to advance the talks about denuclearization, then the Secretary of State made it clear that the United States will not hesitate to unveil new sanctions against North Korea. So we are hours away from the meeting in which Donald Trump will be able to take the measure of Kim Jong-un, and Mike Pompeo at least is expressing confidence that one way or another this meeting will offer a clear roadmap for the future.
Like what you said, Secretary Pompeo very, very clear in his rhetoric at that press conference that you were just at. But on the other hand, we're also seeing sort of a grey stance from President Trump. Is a potential conflict on the issue of North Korea sort of brewing between the two men?
Well, you know, I think Mike Pompeo has been trying to focus the attention not just of the North Koreans, but arguably the attention of President Trump himself. Remember that this day began with President Trump taking to Twitter on multiple occasions to continue hitting out at the Canadian government, at the European governments for their treatment of him at the G7 summit. And, you know, a morning where you would expect him to have his nose buried in the briefing books to be preparing for this historic meeting with Kim Jong-un was instead largely focused on the president repeating his contention that essentially Canada and his allies in Europe have treated him unfairly on the issue of trade. There's a potential problem in all of that for President Donald Trump, because if you're Kim Jong-un going into these talks, you also want to establish that there's a sense of trust that you can do business with Donald Trump, and you've just watched him shred alliances with the government of Canada. And so if you are Kim Jong-un, just how far are you going to be certain that Donald Trump, after the summit ends tomorrow and he clambers aboard Air Force One and heads back to the United States, isn't going then to have a bad case of buyer's remorse as he had in the immediate aftermath of that G7 summit in Canada?
All right, thanks for that, Simon. I will go over to Lim Yoon-suk next, who's standing by here in Singapore as well. Yoon-suk, these are probably the most major diplomatic talks Mr. Kim Jong-un has engaged in since becoming North Korea's leader. How has he been preparing for tomorrow?
Well, we don't know exactly what Chairman Kim Jong-un has been doing all on Monday, because we have really had no kind of official statements or anything from the North Korean side. But it looks like it has been a very busy day for him as he prepares for this historic summit with the U.S. President Donald Trump. We know that there has been several rounds of meetings between the United States and North Korea. And in fact, there'll be more going on tonight, too, as they try to fine-tune the details and try to work out the wordings of this agreement, hopefully, that the two leaders will be able to sign. Now, listening to what the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had to say, it does seem as if they still have to work out some of those details. And we also heard him saying that, it's very likely that the two leaders will only be able to settle this, and it's for them to be able to go in and talk about this. And we know that there will be this one-to-one meeting session between them with just only the translators. And so that might be the timing. That might be the time when both of them decide whether they will be going ahead with the signing or any kind of an agreement between the two countries that could change the future of the Korean Peninsula and the fate of the South and North Koreans. And so I think, inside that St. Regis Hotel where he has been staying since he's been here in Singapore, there's been a lot of discussions going on among the North Korean delegates and Chairman Kim, and I'm sure that we'll be finding out more once he meets with the U.S. President Donald Trump on Tuesday.
All right, Yoon Suk, the expanded talks, that's, the summit. Do we know who will be accompanying Mr. Kim for that, though?
Well, we don't know exactly who is going to be at that meeting, but we do know some of the delegates who have come, who've come here to Singapore with him. We know that he's brought his sister, Kim Jong, and she's someone who has been out there in the spotlight in the last few months. She was the one that he sent all the way to South Korea for the first time ever, and she was the one who met with the South Korean President Moon Jae-in, offering this letter, this message from her brother, saying that he wanted to have inter-Korean dialogue. And in fact, the two sides have met twice, not just once, since that message was conveyed to President Moon Jae-in, and also Kim Yong-chol. And this is the person who has played a crucial role in getting this whole summit together. He's the one who went all the way to Washington to meet with the U.S. President Donald Trump, and also carried this letter from the chairman, Kim Jong-un. And so he's going to be there. We also know that the defense minister is here. And that's why experts are saying that it's very likely that they will be talking about the security guarantee, the political guarantee that North Korea wants. And that is establishing diplomatic ties between the two sides, and also getting rid of this hostilities between South and North Korea that we see on the border separating the two Koreas, and hopefully replacing that armistice that was signed in 1953 with a permanent peace treaty. And so all of them are here. We do expect them to be in the meetings together with the U.S. delegates. But then, as I said earlier, there will be this one-to-one session. And many experts are saying that knowing that these are two unpredictable leaders, anything can happen. And I think, it is, we can always say that, it's going to be a decision by these two leaders that will really determine whether they are willing to sit down and sign this agreement, come up with a successful summit, as South Korean President Moon Jae-in had expressed hopes for earlier. And he said that, this is a gift that the two leaders will be able to give to the world, and especially to the Koreans living on both sides of that border. And so lots at stake in that historic summit meeting on Tuesday between the two leaders.
All right, Yoon Suk, I want to bring Simon back in right now. So, Simon, tomorrow's summit is, we know that it's going to kick off with a one-on-one meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim. Simon, very quickly, what is Mr. Trump going to want to get out from this?
He wants to get the measure of Kim Jong-un. It's as simple as that, Glenda. For Donald Trump, these relationships with other heads of state are all about, as he put it last week, touch and feel. It's all about trying to understand what makes Kim Jong-un tick and assess whether he is truly interested in making a deal. And Donald Trump believes, partly as a result of his career in business, that he has the capacity to look into Kim Jong-un's eyes and understand whether he is serious about all of this. The danger in all of that, of course, is that American presidents in the past have looked into the eyes of foreign leaders and thought that they were seeing their soul. Remember, that's what George W. Bush said about his first meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, that relationship soon became extremely frosty. So there is an inherent danger in that one-on-one meeting that Donald Trump misconstrues what he's seeing when he meets Kim Jong-un. And there's also a danger that his national security officials worry about. How can they control what Donald Trump says behind closed doors to the North Korean leader? How can they keep him on script? They've had terrible trouble doing that ever since he walked into the White House. And I suspect that as they head to bed tonight, they're worried that they may have trouble with that again tomorrow.
That's exactly as what you said, because the playbook gets thrown out the window, isn't it, when you put Donald Trump in a room together with an equally unpredictable person. Yoon Suk, I'd like to get your thoughts on that from the North Korean perspective, if you will. Would they have preferred to meet Donald Trump just alone, or perhaps with his other working officials with him?
Well, you know, this is the first time that the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is really meeting someone outside of North Korea, apart from having met with the South Korean President Moon Jae-in and also the Chinese President Xi Jinping. And so this is going to be for the chairman Kim Jong-un going into somewhere new, a new territory for him. But many experts are saying that being the two unpredictable leaders that we know both of them are, it is very possible that they might be able to do more between themselves and apart, away from the other delegates. We will have to wait and see, but definitely we know what the U.S. wants, but North Korea also has a clear plan. They know what they want to get out of the United States. We've heard from several officials, foreign officials, and in fact, with Singapore's foreign minister saying that North Korea is sincere and it wants to bring about changes. It wants to denuclearize, but it definitely wants those guarantees. It wants those political, security, and economic guarantees from the United States before it can go ahead and do any of that denuclearization.
All right, you know, we know that denuclearization will definitely be high on the agenda tomorrow, but the U.S. and North Korea, now they seem to have a very different idea of what denuclearization actually means. Simon, you know, give us a perspective from, you know, Mr. Trump's point of view or America's point of view. What is denuclearization for them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, there are vast differences and vast gaps that have to be bridged if there is going to be what the United States wants, which is that verifiable, irreversible, complete denuclearization of North Korea. But there are big questions that arise as a result of that. Would North Korea, for example, be allowed to maintain any kind of nuclear activities that were focused on peaceful use, energy use, for example? Would that be beyond the pale from an American perspective? And how will the Americans actually focus on what Mike Pompeo characterized as the V word today? Verifiable. How can you be absolutely certain that the North Koreans are living up to any commitments that they make, especially when you start from a stance of not actually really knowing what they've got? You've got an idea about what they've got, but until those talks advance, you can't be certain that you have a comprehensive picture of what actually exists on North Korean soil. So this is going to be a very long, complex and detailed discussion.
And Yoon Suk, by all accounts, the U.S. side incredibly confident. I know that the U.S. has also spoken to the South Koreans, and the South Koreans are also very confident of achieving their aims from tomorrow's summit. Does that necessarily imply that North Korea is going to come out with the shorter end of the stick?
Well, we will have to wait and see. And yes, definitely the South Korean President Moon Jae-in has expressed hopes and expectations that this will become a successful summit. And, you know, earlier I said that he hopes that the two leaders will be able to give a gift to the whole world. But we will have to wait and see, because we're talking about the North Korean leader, and North Korea has really laid out in details all its plans and what it really wants out of this denuclearization. It seems like the chairman Kim is determined. He does want to perhaps go ahead with this, but he wants to do it his way and not the U.S. way. And one thing that experts have been saying is that he doesn't want preconditions attached to that denuclearization, and that's something that the U.S. and the international community have always asked North Korea to do. So we'll have to wait and see. We'll see what the U.S. has to offer, and I think that is going to be the main point here: the security guarantees, the political guarantees, because North Korea wants to establish diplomatic ties with the United States. It also wants to see the replacement of that armistice that technically ended the Korean War in 1953 with a permanent peace treaty, and definitely wants those economic sanctions, because recently, since the chairman Kim Jong-un to power, he has been taking this dual approach, this two-way steps in dealing in the way that he's been running North Korea, and that is the military, building up its nuclear program, but also he wants to build up North Korea's economy. he has already built up North Korea's nuclear capabilities to some extent, and now he wants to focus on the economy. And he believes that the United States can help, and he wants the international community to come in and help North Korea. So we'll have to wait and see at this historic summit on Tuesday.
All right, Yoon Suk, Simon, thanks very much for that. We've been speaking there with our correspondents, Lim Yoon Suk and Simon Marks, who are with us in Singapore for this historic event.
Well, President Donald Trump will visit Singapore again in November at the invitation of Singapore's President Halimah Yacob. The Foreign Affairs Ministry said Mr. Trump's state visit will be in conjunction with the 6th ASEAN-US Summit and the 13th East Asia Summit.
Now, this was discussed during Mr. Trump's meeting with Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong at the Istana today. Brandon Tanoto with more.
Broad smiles and a firm handshake for the cameras. This after a private meeting between US President Donald Trump and Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. During the meeting, both leaders reaffirmed the excellent Singapore-US relations across the economic, defense and security spheres. They also discussed developments in the region and around the world. Mr. Trump said the US continues to support Singapore's chairmanship of ASEAN and will remain committed to engage the region. Mr. Trump and his delegation were then hosted to lunch by Mr. Lee. Also present was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders, and White House Chief of Staff John Kelly. Mr. Lee's delegation included Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Foreign Affairs Minister Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, Home Affairs and Law Minister K. Shanmugam, Communications and Information Minister S. Iswaran, and Education Minister Ong Ye Kung. In a photo shared by Mr. Ong on social media, the lunch menu included lobster bisque, Angus beef tenderloin, and chendol ice cream. Now, Mr. Trump's Singapore host also had a surprise for him. He was given an early birthday cake. Mr. Trump turned 72 on Thursday. Now, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has also hosted the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un here at the Istana for a bilateral meeting on Sunday. Now, Mr. Lee and Mr. Kim discussed about Singapore-North Korea relations as well as developments in the north and the region. Now, remember, Mr. Lee also complimented the bold and admirable decision by Mr. Kim and Mr. Trump to come together for the summit. The summit will be the first meeting between a sitting US president and a North Korean leader, and it could see North Korea dismantle its nuclear arsenal in return for economic and security guarantees. Brendan Tanoto, Channel News Asia, Singapore.
Now, a year ago, who would have thought that we'd be at this stage? The taunts and threats between Mr. Kim and Donald Trump were flowing fast. So let's take a look at how events played out to get us to this historic summit. Kim Jong-un set things in motion with his New Year's address. Now, see how he ditched those dark tones and went for a grey suit? A state-run South Korean think tank said it reflected a softer image. And that day, Mr. Kim made a surprise offer for talks with Seoul. He was also open to North Korea's taking part in Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. But even as he made this peace offer to the South, he also had a warning for the US. Mr. Kim declared there was a nuclear button on his desk. Donald Trump laughed off the threat, and he said his nuclear button was bigger and powerful and that it worked. Now, while the two leaders traded barbs, the South took up the North's offer. The first formal inter-Korean talks in more than 2 years were held at the border truce village of Panmunjom, and the North offered to send its team to the Pyeongchang Games in February. And then in March, the South Korean National Security Advisor, who was in Washington at the time, said Mr. Kim was willing to meet Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump formally accepted the invitation 2 days later. And then the White House set a timeline for the end of May. Big progress was to be made in April, with Mr. Kim stepping across the Korean border for a historic summit with President Moon. And all this time, speculation building on where the Trump-Kim summit would take place. South Korean media said Singapore and Mongolia were shortlisted. The big reveal came on Twitter. Mr. Trump said he would meet Mr. Kim in Singapore on the 12th of June. And as a goodwill gesture, Pyongyang said it would dismantle its nuclear test site and invite foreign journalists to attend. Journalists were busy making other bookings too for the Trump-Kim summit. Then came the first dampener, North Korea's reaction to an interview that dated back to April. Mr. Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, had called for the North to follow the Libya model for denuclearization. Now, that model eventually led to the death of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. He was killed by rebels 8 years after renouncing nuclear weapons. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence also warned that the North could end up like Libya. And North Korean Vice Foreign Minister dismissed Mr. Pence's remarks as stupid, and she said the North would not beg for dialogue. So with talks appearing to be on shaky ground, South Korean President Moon Jae-in swung into damage control mode. He headed to Washington and met Mr. Trump. But 2 days later, Mr. Trump, we know, called off the summit. He then lobbed the ball in North Korea's court. His letter to Mr. Kim, quote, "Please do not hesitate to call or write if you change your mind," well, unquote. And some political observers said it was a staged walkout by a master negotiator. Mr. Moon and Mr. Trump, or rather Mr. Kim, held an impromptu 2-hour meeting in the demilitarized zone to salvage the summit. In a televised address, Mr. Moon reiterated the North's commitment to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and also a sit-down with Mr. Trump. The U.S. president then reversed his stance and said June 12 had not changed. And since then, we have seen a flurry of diplomatic activity to make this summit happen. Well, Avril Hong will join us again after the break to bring us the latest from the global markets as they wait for the summit to begin. You want to stay with us.
We're slightly more than 12 hours away from tomorrow's high-stakes summit between US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And preparations on Sentosa are kicking into high gear.
Well, Channel News Asia understands that the area immediately outside the summit venue at Capella Hotel will be locked down starting tonight, midnight. And this includes the pavements right outside the hotel. Okay, John, you actually just came back from, Sentosa. Tell us more about that.
So, like what you've said, the area surrounding Capella Hotel is going to be locked down. Right now, if you were there and you drive past Capella, you'll see rows of yellow barricades being set up. You'll see concrete blockades being set up as well, checkpoints. So really, it is a scenario where security is being treated very, very seriously. However, if you're going there for leisure, if you're going there to visit the island for fun, you won't experience anything very much out of the ordinary. For today, at least, I can't be sure what it's going to be like tomorrow. I suspect because the authorities have always said that they want to keep things as normal as possible, things won't be very bad, except for the area around Capella Hotel. But as you can see from the pictures, that's the scene. That's the scene. There we go. The scene right outside. We were driving past Capella Hotel, and you can see the enhanced police presence in and around that area. But like I said, not very much different, I suspect, for visitors who want to visit the island.
So there's only one way. What we do know is there's only one way in and one way out of Capella Hotel, and it's also not just about security that you also observed, right?
Right, because in any major meeting of leaders, there's bound to be diplomatic protocol, and these have to be rehearsed to perfection. It's the same whether you're at the ASEAN summit, whether you're at the G7 summit. It means who welcomes who to the meeting, who opens the doors, who serves what, who ushers who to the tables, who sits where. So these are very fine details that need to be hammered out, and I have no doubt at all, because of the magnitude of the event tomorrow, that these have been all ironed out today, possibly by late tonight.
Right, as you say, all those protocol would be in place by then, and especially for that, photo opportunity that everybody wants to take.
Exactly.
So, both the US and North Korean officials, they're making last-minute preparations as well, hours before the leaders of the both countries meet. They've been holding talks today, looking to bridge gaps over the term denuclearization, which means different things to the two parties.
Jeremy Ko has been stationed outside the Ritz-Carlton Hotel where the meeting has been taking place, and he joins us now. Jeremy, what do we know about the US-North Korea meetings held today? I know you've been there for a very, very long time.
Well, not much is known about the content of discussions, but this is the very hotel where North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister met with the US Ambassador to the Philippines, Sung Kim, earlier today. And this was where they arrived at about 9:30 a.m. local time for Sung Kim, and about 9:45 p.m. for Ms. Cho Soon-hui from North Korea. And the talk started about 10 a.m. local time, and there was a 2.5-hour break for lunch, and after which they continued at discussions about 2:30 p.m. local time, and about 5 p.m. local time. That's when Ms. Cho departed the venue first, followed by Mr. Sung quite a while later. So we don't know what was discussed because none of them addressed the media who were stationed here. Lots of media here earlier today, but we're expecting them to discuss vast differences, interpretations, if you like, between what they term denuclearization. Now, on the U.S. side, we know that they're talking, as Mike Bolton, the U.S. Secretary of State, has mentioned, they're talking about the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. Whereas on the North Korean side, they're talking about denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. That would involve the removal of the U.S. Nuclear umbrella that covers South Korea as well as Japan. And also, it might entail the removal of some 29,000 U.S. troops from South Korea as well. Speaking to reporters here in Singapore earlier, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that the U.S. talks with Ms. Cho have helped to narrow the differences between both sides, even though he didn't say what differences there are. He also said that the U.S. is prepared to give unprecedented security assurances to North Korea. That's, as we know, security is what North Korea has been asking for. That's why they developed nuclear weapons in the very first place. So what sort of security assurances that they will give to North Korea in tomorrow's talks between U.S. President Donald Trump as well as North Korean leader Kim Jong-un? We'll have to wait and see. But also, it seems like their expectations have been lowered ahead of tomorrow's talks as well. Secretary Pompeo has also said that he hoped that this summit will set the conditions for future talks as well. That seems to lower the bar significantly ahead of tomorrow's talks. This seems to suggest that both sides want to ensure that tomorrow's summit will be a success no matter what, but at what cost, we'll have to wait and see till we know what comes out of tomorrow's talks.
All right, Jeremy, thanks very much for that update. Jeremy Ko there reporting for us live from Ritz-Carlton Hotel.
Now, it's not just the world's media looking at what's happening in Singapore. The global stock market also looking on. Now, Asia's stocks recovered from early losses today and mostly edged higher ahead of the summit tomorrow that might help ease regional tensions. Let's zoom in on South Korea's benchmark first. Now, the Kospi, it ended the day higher, 0.75%. Remember, it snapped a 5-day winning streak on Friday. Well, it made those gains today. Let's check in on the South Korean currency. Now, the won is inched higher against the greenback today. Meanwhile, stocks seem to potentially benefit from inter-Korean projects lifted as well, including Hyundai Elevator. It's the biggest stakeholder of Hyundai Asan, which has engaged in a number of North Korea-related projects. Other companies which may benefit from potential investments in North Korea, they're Sangyong Cement and fertilizer maker Namhae Chemical Corp. They're on fertile ground today. Now, staying in Seoul, a hack on a South Korean exchange over the weekend sparked fresh concerns. Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ripple all traded lower at some point today, though Bitcoin and Ethereum seem to have clawed their way into positive territory. Now, South Korea's CoinRail didn't reveal how much was taken in the attack, but said it's working with authorities to track down the culprits. Let's take a look elsewhere in East Asia. Japan's benchmark Nikkei 225, it closed the day up as well. In Hong Kong, the Hang Seng higher. In Shanghai, though, the composite was a bit lower amid trade fears. Now, turning to the summit venue, Singapore, the STI, it ticked up slightly today. And it seems investors are turning their attention to Singapore's consumer stocks. Shangri-La Asia, which trades in Singapore and Hong Kong, it finished the day higher. Now, it reached a one-month high last Thursday as a special zone around its flagship hotel was established. Now, Genting Singapore stocks also ended the day higher, and it owns and operates Resorts World Sentosa, located on the same island that the summit will be held. Singapore Airlines, Southeast Asia's biggest airline, also gained amid an influx of travelers for the event. Now, over in Europe, the FTSE in London, as well as the benchmarks of France and Germany, are buoyant at the moment in early trading. But what we're really looking out for is reaction from U.S. markets when they open in about 2 hours from now. We'll be back shortly. Let's go to Glenda and John. We'll have more from you.
All right, thanks very much, Ariel, for that. Well, President Donald Trump will meet with Kim Jong-un in an unprecedented meeting. So no sitting American president has ever had a face-to-face meeting with a North Korean leader.
And ahead of that, thousands of journalists have descended on Singapore, with the majority of them working out of the International Media Center, which is where our very own Dawn Tan is at right now. And Dawn, it's been a very, very long day for you. How has that been?
It certainly has been a long day, John. We've completely lost the light out here by Republic Boulevard below the flyer. But all day long, there's been this great sense of anticipation building within the walls, the 23,000 square feet of working space inside the International Media Center, where those journalists from all over the world and all over the region, they've been furiously getting their stories together as we race headlong towards that summit tomorrow. Now, you can't see it behind me because it's probably too dark, but dotted behind me still, to my right and to my left, are journalists down there doing their pieces to camera. That's language only you and I probably understand, but filing their stories back down there with just a few lights dotting just below the Marina Bay Sands. John.
All right, Don, Glenda here as well. Now, you mentioned thousands of journalists all set to cover tomorrow's summit. How are they preparing for the big day, though?
Well, Glenda, you mentioned you were talking to Simon earlier on, and he talked about the fact that only 3 meals separate President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un from tomorrow's meeting. It's quite the opposite over here. The journalists here finding some kind of unity and collaboration as they tuck in the dining hall that's serving mostly, what else? Food from Singapore. Singapore favorites like laksa and chicken rice, no less. It's also at those meals that they've been discussing and sharing information, because there's been a dearth of information coming to us about just what's going to happen. We're kind of in the dark, quite literally. Glenda.
All right, thanks for that, Dawn Tan, and she's at the International Media Center there. But still ahead, both leaders, they arrived yesterday in Singapore with their own special vehicles, and a look at their respective cars ferrying the leaders of the United States and North Korea after the break. And welcome back to Channel News Asia's special coverage of the Trump-Kim summit. Now the countdown has started and we're just hours away from the historic first meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a current North Korean leader. Ahead of that, U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo says that talks with Pyongyang are moving rapidly.
Sanctions will remain until North Korea completely and verifiably eliminates its weapons of mass destruction programs. If diplomacy does not move in the right direction, and we are hopeful that it will continue to do so, those measures will increase. President Trump recognizes Chairman Kim's desire for security and is prepared to ensure that a North Korea free of weapons of mass destruction is also a secure North Korea.
His briefing to the US press corps follows Donald Trump's earlier saying that the summit with Kim Jong-un could work out very nicely. Mr. Trump visited Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong at the Istana, where both men held a private bilateral meeting before sitting down to a working lunch.
The North Korean leader himself visited Mr. Lee yesterday and thanked Singapore for hosting the summit. Mr. Kim will meet the US president tomorrow at Sentosa's Capella Hotel.
Now, both Kim Jong-un and Mr. Donald Trump arrived in Singapore on Sunday. Mr. Trump came from the G7 summit in Canada, and that's a long, long flight. So what did he travel on?
Well, it roars, has nearly 400 square meters of space, and can travel anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. And it's perhaps the most recognizable aircraft in the world, and arguably the most important one considering the passenger it carries.
Now, we're talking, in case you haven't guessed, about Air Force One. And here are some facts about this flying fortress. The specially configured Boeing 747-200B is known by call sign Air Force One only when it carries the President of the United States. It's over 70 meters long, weighs over 375,000 kilograms, can fly over 13,000 meters high, and with 4 powerful jets, achieves a maximum speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour.
And the aircraft has a range of over 12,000 kilometers and can be refueled in mid-air in case of an emergency. But reports say the next Air Force One is not scheduled to have this feature because Mr. Trump wants to cut costs.
Now, the aircraft has 2 main entrances and exits. The president, his family, and special guests use this one that you're about to see, and that's near the nose of the plane. Journalists and other staff aboard or board through this doorway in the rear.
And when the president's on board, Air Force One acts as his mobile office and command center in times of conflict. Now, his private office located at the front of the jet was upgraded in the wake of the September 11 attacks to allow him to address the nation while airborne. And the plane also boasts 85 phone lines and 19 TV screens, which allow America's commander-in-chief to stay in touch with events on the ground. And there's also a conference room where meetings are held and a private suite for the president and family to rest.
Now, also on board, a compact operating theatre and a doctor should the president or anyone else need medical attention. And just in case, reserves of the president's blood type are also stored on board.
And to fend off any attack, now this aircraft boasts its own defensive systems. These include countermeasures such as chaff to help evade missiles, as well as protection against the electromagnetic pulse of a missile exploding near the fuselage. So needless to say, the aircraft's shell is armor-plated and all windows bulletproof. It's designed to even withstand a nuclear blast from the ground. And once on the ground, the president is ferried to his next destination in another unique vehicle.
That's right, we're talking about his state-of-the-art limo, otherwise called the Beast, and for good reason. Apart from its imposing looks, it's said to be able to survive a military or chemical attack.
The bulletproof windows are over 12 centimeters thick, and the armored doors 20 centimeters. Each door is said to weigh as much as the cabin door of a Boeing 757.
And even the car's tires are puncture resistant and can run flat if required. And inside, the president can have secure video conferences with just about anyone he needs to speak with, including the Situation Room at the White House in the event of an emergency.
And there are 12 such limos in the fleet, and they are rotated and sent ahead in large military cargo planes, so the president's ride is always waiting for him and not the other way around.
All this comes at a cost as well. It's rumored to be $15 million just to build one of those.
Exactly.
Moving on, one of the most visible components of the North Korean entourage, the group of men protecting Kim Jong-un. Many people would have caught a glimpse of them togged out in smart suits and running alongside the limo carrying Mr. Kim. They stopped at the police barricade as Mr. Kim was heading to the Istana for his meeting with Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. Now, this particular group of bodyguards first emerged in the public eye in April at the Inter-Korean Summit. According to reports, this elite Guard unit goes through years of rigorous training. Fitness, marksmanship, martial arts skills, and even looks are said to be prerequisites. Every bodyguard is meticulously vetted, with his family history also reportedly being checked.
And the North Korean leader has a special ride of his own. It's an extended limousine, a Mercedes-Benz S-Class. And it's part of his collection of exotic and sports cars, which is set to number about 100 and cost some $20 million. Now, the limo itself is worth about $1.5 million US. It's over 6.4 meters long and is reportedly made of bulletproof steel and armored fiber that can deflect a bullet. And to ensure a quick exit from any tough situation, it features run-flat tires. Inside, the niceties include a fridge. And unconfirmed reports also say the car has something the U.S. president's beast does not have: a toilet. Now, that's according to U.S. network Fox, which cites a North Korean defector who served as a National Guard. Now, analysts aren't sure how Mr. Kim came to obtain these and other vehicles. Now, remember, the United Nations sanctions have prevented the North Korean government from buying them directly from the automaker.
So both leaders are expected to be in their respective vehicles as they head to tomorrow's meeting. But what's on the agenda? Well, from Washington, Harry Horton looks ahead to the issues Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim will be wanting to find answers to.
In just a few months, the war of words has been cast aside.
They will be met with fire and fury.
For flattery and diplomacy to take center stage.
Kim Jong was, he really has been very open and I think very honorable.
In a quest to succeed where his predecessors failed, President Trump has bet that by meeting with Kim Jong-un, he can strike up a relationship that could lead to denuclearization. But it won't be easy. Kim has gone from an international pariah to a world leader in diplomatic overdrive.
I think he has proved more savvy on the international stage than perhaps people anticipated. And in that sense, I think from the perspective of American negotiators, you need to actually take the North Koreans very seriously.
The US says Kim Jong-un is willing to denuclearize. The problem is agreeing on what that means and how quickly it should happen.
Unless we see very, very concrete, verifiable steps where inspectors can go in, where things are dismantled, unless we see some of that, we're probably looking at yet another case of North Korea getting a timeout and getting a pass.
In recent weeks, President Trump has played down expectations and says the summit will be the start of a process. But he has dangled the possibility of a peace deal between North and South Korea, formally ending an almost 70-year conflict.
We could sign an agreement. As you know, that would be a first step. It's what happens after the agreement that really is the big point.
Not everyone thinks that's the right approach.
If you offer that right up front, you remove your ability to continue to put pressure on the North Koreans in some way to move forward on denuclearization, because you're not really holding anything out there still to incentivize them.
Without doubt, this is Donald Trump's biggest gamble as president so far. He's determined to solve this crisis, and he's unlikely to get another opportunity like this again.
If this doesn't work, and if the president needs to keep pressure on, and indeed increase pressure, he's going to find it hard, because he's raised expectations so much. It's going to be very difficult to get anyone other than the Japanese, basically, and perhaps European allies, to pressure North Korea. The Chinese aren't going to want to go back there. The South Koreans aren't going to want to go back there. And there's no reason why they should, because the United States is not going to credibly be able to say, well, that didn't work, we're going to use a military strike now. I think that's off the table.
The meeting will be historic, but with such a mercurial duo, few people can predict much more than that. Harry Horton, Channel News Asia, Washington.
And for more, we're now joined in studio by Dane Chamorro, Senior Partner for Asia Pacific and Control Risk. Dane, we just heard that mercurial, very mercurial two individuals here. The question then is, how prepared are these two men? How prepared are their teams, going into this Trump-Kim talks?
I think they're probably better prepared than they were a week ago. We know that the working level for the last couple of weeks has been putting together the outlines of probably what kind of deal can be announced, let's put it that way, in very kind of high-level terms. So I suspect that, and certainly the North Koreans are well prepared because I'm sure they've been wanting this for a long time. So yeah, I think they're probably both ready for whatever the announcement will be after tomorrow's talks.
We saw the two working level groups meet at the Ritz-Carlton today. By all accounts, they spent a lot of time behind closed doors, sort of hashing out what needs to be done tomorrow. Should that worry the international community that potentially there could be sticking points that cannot be resolved ahead of that summit?
So there are inevitably going to be sticking points. I think both sides have a lot invested in this looking positive. So coming out with a positive statement that says, broadly speaking, this will be the way forward. The devil's in the details, as always. And when you talk about denuclearization, a lot of it comes down to, as you all have touched on before, what does it actually mean? Because it means different things to both parties. And North Korea has a history of having committed to denuclearization previously and then not followed through. So there's a lot of mistrust, understandably so. And this is, a great kind of historic meeting, but it is that, and there's only one day, and you can only do so much in one day.
Okay, speaking of that mistrust here, what would be the worst case scenario coming out of this summit that, it turns negative, nothing good comes out of it? What does it then mean? Is it status quo for, South Korea and its neighbors? What are the implications for ASEAN as well then?
So a lot of it depends on expectations. I think expectations now are kind of raised. So then it kind of depends on what they come out with as to whether it meets those expectations. The worst case scenario, obviously, is that there's some kind of collapse. Let's say President Trump doesn't feel the love from, Kim Jong-un or whatever it is. He said he would know in the first 5 minutes or the first minute whether it was going to be positive. So if that falls apart and then you go back to kind of where we were 6+ months ago, a lot of vitriol, a lot of name calling, a lot of tweeting, a lot of threats, a lot of saber rattling. Obviously, that's the worst case scenario. And that doesn't help any of the countries in Asia from an economic perspective, from an uncertainty perspective, from a sanctions perspective, because that would be probably the fallback. As you've seen that the Secretary of State said, sanctions don't come off until North Korea denuclearizes. But we know that already some of the sanctions have started to be eased off from China, for example, and from Russia. So the trade is kind of coming back to normal from where it was, let's say, a few months ago. So if you tried to reinstall that situation where you said, okay, we're going back to full-on maximum pressure, as President Trump called it, that's not good for anybody, obviously.
I want to come back to what you brought up earlier about a potential trust deficit between both sides. And you mentioned there that North Korea has broken promises before. On the flip side, the U.S. quite recently has also broken a promise. Recall the Iran nuclear deal. They've backed out of that. And how will North Korea be viewing that incident in negotiations tomorrow?
So I think North Korea views themselves as being in a very different position than Iran. They have weapons. Iran is still developing weapons. And I think they see that as fundamentally the major difference. We have these, and you can't take them away from us. And therefore, you have to deal with us in a different way. And there's some validity to that argument, right? I think what we've learned, I think what the world has learned, is that President Trump doesn't really like an agreement that he wasn't part of, right? So whether it's climate change, whether it's NAFTA, whether it's TPP, he's quite willing to kind of throw his toys out, walk away, if he doesn't feel it's, by his definition, in the best interest of the country, and he hasn't done it. So I suspect what North Korea will be vested in is the idea that if he does this deal, then he's vested in it, and he will stick to it. But again, that's only as long as a presidential term. And this is one of the challenges of the U.S. system, right, is that that's 4 years or 8 years. And after that, who knows? Right.
Speaking of that, you say when he doesn't like the deal, he just walk away from it. This is coming so soon from the G7 summit that, we saw in Canada. It turns out to be quite a disastrous one. What do you make of, the fact that the U.S. president has now, decided to just walk away from this group of 7, meeting, and then now cozying up, with North Korea? Almost seems like he's alienating the Western allies. I mean, is that the case? How should we be reading into this? What should we be looking at here?
I think it's probably less strategic than it seems. He tends to be a very tactical, in-the-moment kind of person. He said for a long time, and in fact during the campaign, that he would be willing to meet with Kim Jong-un. So now that's going to happen. So I think we shouldn't look at them necessarily as being connected to one another. Some people have said that, you know, now he's more likely to do a deal with Kim Jong-un because he's just had this disastrous kind of meeting with the G7. I'm not so sure that you know, he actually frames things in those terms. Again, I think the G7 issue was one of, this is not something I signed up to. This isn't my deal. Somebody before me did it. I don't like it, and therefore I'm going to walk away. I think the North Korea issue is quite a different one in his mind anyway, and they're not necessarily connected.
Now, earlier we heard Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sort of adopt this carrot and stick approach with North Korea in his briefing with White House correspondents. If indeed that follows through and sanctions are lifted, aid supplies are sent in, North Korea opens up a little bit, what would that mean for the world economy? What can North Korea bring that perhaps the world hasn't seen before?
Probably not a lot. It's a relatively small, poor country, so they have some commodities, coal, iron ore, seafood, and things like that. They have some basic manufacturing capability in textiles, and all of those things have been hit by sanctions. But this is not going to change the economic picture of Northeast Asia. Probably the biggest beneficiaries of an opening in North Korea would be, first of all, China, because Chinese companies are already quite large in North Korea, and South Korea, obviously, because they would get access to a much cheaper labor force than they do now. So they would be the two biggest beneficiaries if it truly opened in kind of a China reform type of way. We don't see that at control risk. We don't see that happening. We think that reform, to the extent it's going to be there, is going to be stuck in the economic zones that they've had along the borders, both borders. So it's not a game changer from an economic perspective.
All right, Dane, thanks very much for those insights. We've been speaking there with Dane Chamorro. He's Senior Partner for Asia Pacific at Control Risks.
And still to come, we'll have much more reports on the eve of the Trump-Kim summit here on Channel News Asia. Do stay with us for that.
Now, one of Pyongyang's main goals during the summit, experts say, would be lifting the array of international sanctions imposed on it over the years. Dependable economic data on the North is tough to come by, but there is evidence that these sanctions have been stinging North Korea's economy. this is not to say Pyongyang is struggling to make money. North Korea has several revenue streams. Now let's start with industry. It accounts for over 40% of the country's GDP composition, of which mining formed over 10% in 2016. The mining sector was largely fueled by coal production. Now, China bought a bulk of this, spending some $2 billion on over 20 million tons of the commodity, or enough to power nearly 5 million homes for a year. But China banned coal imports from North Korea in February last year. And in August, it extended the curb to include iron ore and seafood in line with a UN resolution. But Western intelligence sources say North Korea has still been able to export coal to South Korea and Japan via Russia. Another component of industry is manufacturing. Now, this accounted for more than 20% of GDP, with the garment industry playing a big role. Textiles were North Korea's second biggest export in 2016, and Pyongyang is reported to be operating at least 19 factories in the closed Kaesong industrial zone. North Korea also generates revenue from its produce. With a coastline of 2,500 kilometers, fishing grounds for North Korean fishermen should be ample. Well, not quite. Experts say Pyongyang sold fishing rights off its west coast to Beijing for $75 million, forcing its own fishermen to go east. And it could be why dozens of North Korean boats containing dead bodies have turned up on the Japanese coast in recent time. Fuel shortages have also left numerous vessels stranded. Now, services such as communications and transportation also contribute to the North Korean economy. Its flag carrier, Air Koryo, it operates flights to China and Russia. Now, remittances from overseas North Korean workers, such as those in the Chinese city of Dandong, are also a source of revenue. And Pyongyang takes as much as 45% from a worker's salary. Amid all this, though, North Korea is said to have resorted to a rather unconventional way of making money, and that's cyber heists. North Korean hacking group Lazarus is believed to have been responsible for a spate of attacks on banks, in particular attacks on the SWIFT system, which is used to move money around the world. Cybersecurity firms have linked the group to an $81 million heist at Bangladesh's central bank in 2016, as well as one on Taiwan's Far Eastern International Bank last year, where hackers tried to make off with $60 million, though most of it was recovered. It's also believed to have stolen cryptocurrency from South Korean exchanges. And let's not forget the one in Japan just this year, which was the world's biggest digital currency theft. Now, for more on how North Korea makes its money and is running its economy, we're joined by Associate Professor Vu Min Kwong from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Professor, in the lead up to the summit, there's been skepticism about North Korea's intentions. But you're confident that Mr. Kim's decision to abandon his country's nuclear ambition to focus on economic development is not motivated by any promise of economic assistance. Why is this the case for you?
Actually, I see three critical factors conducive to the major change in North Korea. The first one is receptivity. The second one is a pressure. And the third one is an enabling condition. In terms of receptivity, I think North Korea have tried their best in many ways, but they didn't succeed. And that's why now they have to think seriously what they have to follow to do next. And the success of the country like China and Vietnam, actually with the country with very similar system as North Korea and had made remarkable success in the past few decades, definitely had makes the change very receptive to North Korean system and Mr. Kim himself. The second one is the pressure, the tension, because of the sanction is so severe, and now actually the North Korea, if they cannot change, they will actually collapse. So the change actually necessary. The third one I think is amazing. It's enabling condition. The approach adopted by President Donald Trump actually, I think, very relevant and inspiring to North Korea and to the world, because he focused more on the future, the prosperity of North Korea, rather than just fixing the problem. Fixing problems actually just a consequence of the effort to build prosperity. So it's very acceptable by North Korean people and Mr. Kim. So I do believe that these three critical factors are now in place, will actually give us some very optimistic outcome, and I think exceed our expectation in the meeting tomorrow.
All right, Professor Vu, let's take a look at the U.S. standpoint. And in the context of its isolation at the G7 summit over the weekend, where trade issues were front and center, President Trump didn't endorse the usual joint communique. How do you think this moves the pieces on the chessboard going forward into the summit tomorrow in Singapore?
I think two things here. The first one, I think all the Western countries, including the G7 leader, have to rethink themselves also about the conventional way of doing business. I support President Donald Trump in the way that we have to rethink many things. But the second thing is that actually President Donald Trump also have to pay more attention to building credibility rather than just, somehow changing his thinking too quickly. He have to do better job in explaining to the people. So tomorrow, I think they will open the new page of, a relationship with North Korea, but also a new way for the U.S. to show the world that they can build credibility to the enemy, but also to the allies and to the whole world.
Certainly, and we'll be keeping tabs on those changes and developments. Thank you very much for your time. That was Associate Professor Vu Ming Kwong from the NUS Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Stay tuned. We'll have much more coverage on the eve of the Trump-Kim summit here on Channel News Asia.
If you're just joining us, welcome to a special extended edition of Primetime Asia, and the countdown is on as North Korean leader Kim Jong-un gears up to meet with his US counterpart Donald Trump. And before that, Mr. Trump spoke to South Korean President Moon Jae-in, and reportedly the two leaders discussed denuclearization issues. Mr. Moon earlier said he is hoping for a major agreement, and he's optimistic.
이제 새로운 한반도 시대를 염원하는 전 세계인들의 바람이 실현될 수 있도록 두 지도자가 서로의 요구를 통 크게 주고받는 담대한 결단을 기대합니다. 저는 내일 회담이 반드시 성공할 것이라는 전망과 기대를 함께 가지고 있습니다.
Now, in the last year, Mr. Kim oversaw a string of missile and nuclear tests, drawing the ire of the international community. With denuclearization being the focus of these talks, experts see this as a sign that the isolated nation is prepared to engage with the world. Now, since becoming supreme leader of North Korea in 2011, Kim Jong-un has fired and tested more missiles than his father, Kim Il-sung, and his grandfather, Kim Il-sung combined. Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung, rather. Now, North Korea's leader may have been given the title of Little Rocket Man by President Trump as a joke. But having fired over 80 missiles so far, well, maybe Mr. Trump wasn't too far off the track. Now, Kim Jong-un's nuclear missile program may have started off slow, but the series of successes charted in 2017 shows how the North's military might has grown. So for that now, we track back to 2016 and a look at a few significant dates that laid foundations for where we are now. So on February 7, state TV says a long-range rocket carrying the satellite Kwangmongson-4 is put into orbit. And Pyongyang says it's part of its space program. The US and its allies, well, they think differently. They say it's cover for the development of ballistic missile technology. The following month, North Korea claims to have successfully miniaturized nuclear warheads to mount on ballistic missiles. This has never been independently verified. And then in June, it's reported that Kim supervised the test launch of an intermediate range missile. It flew 400 kilometers before coming down in the Sea of Japan. But with a theoretical range of between 2,500 kilometers and 4,000 kilometers, the Musandon rocket could reach the US Pacific territory of Guam. A couple of months later, a submarine-launched ballistic missile is fired off the eastern coast near the city of Sinpo. It travels for about 500 kilometers towards Japan, reaching its air defense identification zone. And South Korea's Yonhap news agency puts full range at 1,000 kilometers on an ordinary trajectory. Now, experts say it shows an improving technological capability for North Korea. And then, within days of each other, in September, North Korea launches 3 ballistic missiles into the waters from the Hwangju region and conducts its 5th and largest nuclear test at Pyongyang on the anniversary of its founding. So now we come to 2017, a year of many firsts for the reclusive state. In February, Pyongyang fires its first medium-range ballistic missile of the year. It coincides with a new face in the White House, US President Donald Trump vowing to get tough. Now, it's estimated that the mid-range Rodong flies about 500 kilometers before landing in the Sea of Japan. The 4th of July, America's Independence Day. Pyongyang says it successfully tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, for the first time. Officials say it reached an altitude of 2,802 kilometers and flew for 39 minutes. Experts say it could allow a missile to hit the U.S. mainland state of Alaska. In the same month that President Trump threatens North Korea with fire and fury, it fires a ballistic missile over Japan for the first time. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe calls it an unprecedented threat. Unusually, it's fired from near Pyongyang, traveling a distance of more than 2,700 kilometers, landing 1,180 kilometers off the Japanese coast. But one report says it's the first missile powerful enough to potentially carry a nuclear warhead. By November, another successful test sends fear across the globe. North Korea declares itself a complete nuclear state as a new type of intercontinental ballistic missile flies higher than any other previously tested and is claimed that can strike anywhere on the US mainland.
Now, those tests lie at the center of the upcoming historic talks between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. Both leaders arrived in Singapore on Sunday and have had a busy time since, as Angela Lim reports.
It's been a whirlwind 24 hours since the arrival of both leaders in Singapore for the historic summit on 12 June. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was the first to touch down at Changi Airport's VIP terminal on Sunday afternoon. Later that evening, US President Donald Trump landed at Paya Lebar Air Base on Air Force One. Both headed straight to their respective hotels just a stone's throw away from each other in downtown Singapore. Mr. Kim at the St. Regis and Mr. Trump at the Shangri-La Hotel. The North Korean leader wasted no time in meeting Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong at the Istana just hours after touchdown, their first ever face-to-face encounter.
The entire world is focusing on the historic summit between the people in the United States of America. And thanks to your sincere efforts, we were able to complete the preparation for the historic summit. And I would like to thank you for that.
In response, Mr. Lee complimented Mr. Kim and US President Donald Trump for the bold and admirable decision to meet. After a night's rest, Mr. Trump was back on Twitter on Monday morning. Among a litany of grievances against Canada and European countries for their trade practices, the president tweeted, "Great to be in Singapore. Excitement is in the air." He then headed to the Istana to have a private meeting with Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, followed by a working lunch between the two sides. Mr. Trump says he expects to have a very interesting meeting tomorrow and thinks things can work out very nicely. Later that day, delegations from the US and North Korea met for a nearly 2-hour working level meeting at the Ritz-Carlton. With the high-stakes summit just hours away, Singapore is taking no chances with security.
We are quietly confident that we have put in place the preparations.
Hosting the summit will cost the city-state nearly $15 million, but Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said it was worth it.
I think that's a long process, but this is a first step, which if the first step happens in Singapore, well, we are happy to be associated with it.
Tomorrow, Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim will take that first step here at this hotel off the coast of mainland Singapore on the tiny resort island of Sentosa. The summit will be the first ever meeting between a sitting US president and a North Korean leader.
We're going for a short break, but do stay with us as we build up towards those historic talks between US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un tomorrow at 9 a.m. Stay with us.
Wait for the outcome of the talks between the two men. We do know this: they both have a striking amount in common. Donald Trump turns 72 this week, and he was born on the 14th of June 1946 in Queens, New York. Kim Jong-un is said to be in his early 30s, but his date of birth is unclear. A widely reported date is the 8th of January 1984, and that would make him 34 years old. North Korea has never confirmed his birthday, but the closest it has come to acknowledging was in 2014.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Now, that's former NBA star Dennis Rodman after an exhibition match in Pyongyang. Mr. Kim is an avid basketball fan, quite like his father. It's unknown whether or not he shares his father's interest in golf. Mr. Trump, on the other hand, is closely associated with the sport. But both men do have this in common: they've both lived a life of luxury. Mr. Trump is the fourth child of New York real estate tycoon Fred Trump. His mother, Mary Ann MacLeod, was a Scottish-born American who immigrated to New York as an unskilled 18-year-old in 1930. Now, both Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim studied at institutes with military affiliations. Mr. Trump was sent off to a military academy when he was 13 as a rebuke for misbehaving at school. Mr. Kim is the fifth among 6 children, the son of North Korean leader Kim Jong-il and Japanese-born Korean dancer Ko Young-hui. And it's believed Mr. Kim studied in Switzerland under the pseudonym Park Eun. He returned to Pyongyang to join the Kim Il-sung Military University. Both Mr. Kim and Mr. Trump were not the first choice for succession, but fate took a turn in their favor. Mr. Kim's older half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, was first in line, and that changed in 2001 after Kim Jong-nam was arrested in Japan after trying to enter the country on a false passport. His detention is said to have embarrassed Pyongyang and harmed what was an already fractured relationship between the two brothers. Kim Jong-nam later went into exile in Macau, and then last year he was assassinated in Malaysia. Kim Jong-un is suspected to have ordered that hit. The next in line, Mr. Kim's elder brother, Kim Jong-chol, was rejected by their father as heir. That left Kim Jong-un to become North Korea's, quote, dear leader when Kim Jong-il died in December 2011. And as far as Mr. Trump goes, he only became the top choice to fill his father's shoes after his older brother, Fred Jr., chose to become a pilot. Now, Fred Trump eventually died of alcohol addiction, an episode that Mr. Trump claims led him to avoid alcohol and cigarettes his entire life. Mr. Trump's career started at his father's thriving real estate business, which he joined after college. He eventually took control of the company and renamed it. In 1971, Elizabeth Trump and Son became the Trump Organization. Now, Mr. Trump built on his father's contacts and expanded his own real estate empire. He says he got started with a small $1 million loan. Now, Donald Trump soon became a household name across America with his foray into reality television. The desire to run for presidency didn't come until the late 1980s. And then at the turn of the millennium, he entered the race as a Reform Party candidate. It was in June of 2015 that Mr. Trump formally announced his entry into the race. And few thought his political campaign would come this far. He was elected on the promise of putting America first. Mr. Kim, too, led with a somewhat similar slogan of military first. He progressed from dear leader to the great successor in no time. Now, after his father's death, Mr. Kim purged North Korea's elite and executed his uncle, among others, for allegedly planning a coup. And he went on to expand North Korea's nuclear weapons program, overseeing 4 nuclear tests, bringing the total tests conducted by the regime to 6. So much that we're keeping track of tonight. Over to you for now, Glenda and John.
All right, thanks, Avril, for that. Now, one country that is looking on these talks with very high hopes is South Korea. The people are hoping that tomorrow's historic summit will produce positive results.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in earlier expressed his wish that the meeting would go well. Now, for more, let's go over to Julie Yu, who's in Seoul at the moment. And Julie, we are hoping that all will go well. And the president did touch on his hopes for the summit. What exactly did he say?
Yeah, John, South Korean President Moon Jae-in expressed confidence that this much anticipated summit between Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim will be a success. But at the same time, he did say that this is only the start of a long process of denuclearizing the North. He said that it would take a year or two, even longer, sounding as if he was preparing those who are expecting too much from the summit from being disappointed, just in case we don't see much progress from that upcoming dialogue. He also stressed that we cannot only rely on U.S.-North Korea talks for the resolution of this nuclear standoff, but rather we must also develop that inter-Korean relationship at the same time. He also went on to ask for the South Korean people's continued support for the cross-border talks that are to begin later this week, including those involving military, the Red Cross, and also sports. And speaking of President Moon, despite the initial expectation of him joining Mr. Kim and Mr. Trump in Singapore, it looks highly unlikely that he'll be there for now. And this is according to the Blue House officials. And Mr. Moon is expected to closely monitor the situation from Seoul to prepare for any follow-up measures on what could come out of the Trump-Kim meeting. But, Glenda and John, we've seen in the lead up to the summit over the last few months, weeks, and even days, anything can happen.
That's right, Julie. Well, there are hopes then that the summit could pave the way for a, possible reunification between North and South Korea. The question is, how is the public sentiment like in South Korea towards this?
Yeah, Glenda, this topic of unification hasn't been and still isn't the most talked about issue in South Korea. It is despite the fact that many are aware of the pain and sorrow that many Korean families who have been torn apart by this Korean War still feel to this day. And I've covered that reunion of the separated families in the past, and their pain and suffering, and they're just heartbreaking to see. So this topic of potential unification is certainly something that is on the minds of many South Koreans, and I'm sure North Koreans as well. But as I found out, the possibility of unification in the near future remains a far-fetched idea for now. Take a look.
The Inter-Korean Summit in April marked a major milestone in terms of relations between the two Koreas. And with images like these still etched firmly in the minds of many South Koreans, all eyes are now on the summit in Singapore, and many are warily optimistic. In a latest poll by research and public opinion survey agency Realmeter showed that some 65% of South Koreans believe the North is genuinely willing to take positive steps to denuclearize, a key factor when it comes to normalizing relations, while only 28% remain skeptical. This is a significant shift considering the fact that prior to the Inter-Korean Summit in April, only about 15% believed that the reclusive regime was willing to give up its nuclear weapons. As South Koreans' overall perception of the North improved, it's inevitable that the notion of unification is also gaining traction.
통일하면 한 10년, 20년은 많이 힘들지도 모르겠는데 그래도 일단 통일을 해놓는 게 좋을 것 같아요. 어차피 지금 잠깐 힘든 거고 나중에 조금씩 국력 회복되면서 지금보다 훨씬 좋은 나라가 될 수 있을 거라 생각해요.
But for some, things have been moving too fast.
갑작스럽게 이렇게 통일 얘기가 진전이 돼가지고 좀 무서운 것도 좀 사실 있고 아직 너무 다른 두 나라인데 또 거기다 이제 미국까지 껴서 세 군데니까 아무래도 좀.
And there are those who rejected outright the idea of having to reunify with the impoverished North.
정상회담돼서 아주 남북 통일이 된다 하더라도 그 이북에 없는 사람 우리 대한민국 사람들이 그 매개 살려야 할 거 아닙니까? 그래 뭐가 좋은 거 있습니까?
While unification is a contentious topic, it's not so complicated when it comes to the desire for peace and stability on the Korean peninsula.
For South Korean people, more important thing is we can live under the peaceful environment and without the threat of missiles and nuclear tests and everything. And then maybe we can exchange people and also, I don't know, the trade with North Korea and open to each other. And then maybe we can go for unification. Well, think about it. That's more practical terms that Korean people approach. So unification, maybe you can think in the future, but not at this point.
And do stay with us as we will have more coverage of the upcoming Trump-Kim summit. Now, welcome back. Just half a day to go before the historic first meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. And ahead of that, some optimism from both sides. U.S. President Donald Trump says the summit could work very nicely, while his Secretary of State said talks are moving along quickly.
The fact that our two leaders are sitting down face to face is a sign of the enormous potential to accomplish something that will immensely benefit both of our peoples and the entire world. President Trump believes that Kim Jong-un has an unprecedented opportunity to change the trajectory of our relationship and bring peace and prosperity to his country.
North Korea's state-run media also heralded the summit as part of a changed era, one that could result in the two sides exchanging views to reset relations. Now for more, let's check in with Olivia Seong, who's in China at the moment. And Olivia, China is a key ally of North Korea. What's the Chinese government's stance on the summit?
Well, John, you know, China is not a direct party in the talks this time round, but it continues to wield influence over the developments. If you just think about it, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un arrived in Singapore yesterday on not on a North Korean aircraft, but on an Air China plane. So if that's one example of, you know, how China is influencing the situation and has a part in its close ties with North Korea. Now, also when asked about this, the China's Foreign Affairs Ministry said that, the request to take the Air China plane had come at the request of North Korea, and that's the reason why they provided the plane for Mr. Kim to come to Singapore. As for the expectations of the summit, well, China has said and stressed before that this is something that is closely watched by the international community, and the Chinese side hopes that the meeting will yield positive results and will go smoothly. And this is an important step to ensuring the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And China's Foreign Affairs Ministry also said that China will continue to do its part to move things in that direction. Guys?
Olivia, you're in Dandong, and that's the border city that faces North Korea. What's the public sentiment like towards this summit between the U.S. president and North Korean leader?
Well, Glenda, I've been talking to people here in China, not only in Dandong, but here in Dandong, there's one key reason why people are looking and closely watching these talks that are going to take place tomorrow. And I'll just show that to you here. It's a bit dark because it's late at night, but if you can see, what's lit up behind me is that bridge, which is the main channel for trade between China and North Korea. Now, that is the reason why people here are closely watching what's going to be happening tomorrow, and that's because when China agreed to impose sanctions on North Korea last year, this town had been, heavily hit, and businesses have suffered from it. Just talking to certain people here, they say the sanctions are still affecting their businesses, but there is also a sense of optimism, especially after Chinese President Xi Jinping met Kim Jong-un twice in 2 months. And that has led to optimism that the situation here could improve.
因为现在听说了有很多什么不安定的因素嘛，是吧？很多，但是我不是说很清楚，但是我知道，但是我希望安定团结。
我觉得应该会向一个好的方向去发展吧，对世界的这个形势稳定有一个好的作用。另外，中国在这里面应该也起了很大的这个作用，因为没有中国的参与的话，美国和朝鲜也不是那么容易达成一定的那个这个和平相处这样的。
朝鲜的问题，这不最近中国和这个朝鲜也是每天都是不是每天，就是最近也是互动比较频繁。然后朝鲜不要改革开放了嘛，这对于整个的国际形势还是比较不错的嘛。我们都推崇这个世界和平，每一个这个国家不管是大小都是这个世界的一部分所以说这个加强之间的交流也是对促进整个这个国际形势也是很有必要的。
All right, many thanks there, Olivia Xiong, speaking to us from the city of Dandong in China.
Now, still to come on this special edition of Primetime Asia, who are the key players behind tomorrow's Trump-Kim summit? We'll take a look at the people closest to the two men after a short break. Stay with us.
The U.S. has offered North Korea some unique security guarantees in a bid to try to persuade it to give up its nuclear arsenal.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said this earlier, half a day before the historic summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un is due to take place.
But as talks progress, now concern is mounting in Japan that Tokyo might lose out. And, that's partly due to the abductee issue. Michio Ishida joins us live from Tokyo right now. So, Mitch, that abductee issue, we know it's significant considering that, Shinzo Abe met Donald Trump before this meeting. Talk us through this.
Yes, well, I'm in the typhoon wind right now. Mr. Abe calls the abduction issue the most important issue. He said he received a phone call from Mr. Trump around 6 p.m. local time, and they spoke for about 30 minutes. Mr. Abe reminded Mr. Trump to raise the abduction issue with the North Korean leader. Now, Japan has brought up the issue with Pyongyang many, many times, but North Korea's response was, it's been resolved. Instead, it demanded that Japan should compensate for its wartime aggressions. Now, talks on this issue hasn't been going anywhere. But Mr. Trump is known to be unpredictable. But he is also said to be a deal maker. So it's anyone's guess what sort of outcome the talks may produce on Tuesday. Now, the whole world, and not just Japanese, will be watching with key interest.
Michio, how is Japan approaching and looking at this issue from the outside into Singapore at the moment?
Well, Japanese TV networks are carrying the Trump-Kim summit extensively. The interest is huge because North Korea is, after all, Japan's close neighbor, and Pyongyang has been firing its missiles over the Japanese archipelago, and that's prompted cities all over Japan to hold evacuation drills. Now, North Korea has conducted a number of nuclear tests, raising a radiation fear among the Japanese, and, Japan is no stranger to adverse effects of radiation due to its own experience from the Fukushima nuclear disaster and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not to mention the abduction issue. So North Korea is a country that worries the Japanese.
All right, thanks for that update, Michio. Michio Ishida there live from Tokyo.
And do stay with us here on our extended coverage on Primetime Asia, as we'll have more reports on the upcoming Trump-Kim summit. Stay with us. Welcome back. The countdown has begun, and we're just hours away from the historic first meeting between a sitting U.S. president and a current North Korean leader. And ahead of that, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says talks with Pyongyang are moving rapidly.
Sanctions will remain until North Korea completely and verifiably eliminates its weapons of mass destruction programs. If diplomacy does not move in the right direction, and we are hopeful that it will continue to do so, those measures will increase. President Trump recognizes Chairman Kim's desire for security and is prepared to ensure that a North Korea free of weapons of mass destruction is also a secure North Korea.
Mr. Donald Trump had earlier said that the summit with Mr. Kim Jong-un could work out very nicely. Mr. Trump visited Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong at the Istana, where both men held a private bilateral meeting.
And both U.S. President Donald Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un are spending their second day in Singapore. And delegates of both sides have mostly kept a low profile. But after the two leaders held separate bilateral meetings with Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, we're getting a clearer picture of who the key players are. So Mr. Trump and his team were at the Istana today for a working lunch with Mr. Lee. The delegation comprised 12 people, including Mr. Trump. Many of them are key players on North Korea-related matters in the Trump administration. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He's been chalking up the air miles, traveling twice to Pyongyang in the past 2 months to meet Kim Jong-un. And he's voiced optimism about the summit, saying that he believes the North Korean leader is poised to make bold decisions that haven't been made before. And also at that meeting, U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. Mr. Bolton is well known to the North Koreans. He's been a thorn in their side since the Bush administration. Mr. Bolton's recent comments suggesting a denuclearization model similar to that of Libya angered Pyongyang and even resulted in threats to call off the summit. Now, a key negotiator in North Korea wasn't at the U.S.-Singapore bilateral meeting. And that's U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines, Sung Kim, also the former top envoy to South Korea. He was holding 11th-hour working-level talks with North Korean Vice Foreign Minister Cho Son-hui. And some of the other key figures in this U.S. delegation: Stephen Miller, senior policy advisor and speechwriter to Mr. Trump, plus White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and Matthew Pottinger, the top Asian affairs official at the National Security Council. Now, as for the North Koreans, Kim Jong-un also held a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Lee shortly after touching down in Singapore on Sunday. Mr. Kim was accompanied by 3 men. Kim Yong-chol, widely known as the leader's right-hand man, was there. He's the vice chairman of the Central Committee of the ruling Workers' Party. You might remember him as the envoy who hand-delivered a letter to Mr. Trump, the one that resulted in the on-off summit being back on again. Ri Yu-yong, vice chairman of the Central Committee, was also at the meeting. Now, he heads international affairs at the party and had previously spent nearly 3 decades at North Korean embassies in Europe. The third person who attended the meeting was No Kwang-chul, North Korea's defense minister. He was only just appointed to the top position during a recent military reshuffle ahead of the summit. He's believed to be more moderate than his predecessor. But let's not forget that the 3 other high-level delegates who accompanied Kim Jong-un on his flight to Singapore. Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho, he held a separate bilateral meeting with his Singapore counterpart, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan. And of course, Mr. Kim's sister, Kim Yo-jung, and Vice Minister Cho Sun-hui, who, as we mentioned, held working-level talks with U.S. Ambassador Sung Kim. And we will still have more here on Primetime Asia. Do stay with us for tomorrow's historic summit. More reports coming up.